Hello, hello. So today we are going to discuss the Reagan Revolution. And make no mistake, Ronald Reagan is truly a revolutionary figure, and not in the let's storm the Bastille and chop off the head of the king kind of revolutionary way. I mean that if you really look at the American government from 1933 until the rise of Ronald Reagan, it was going on a pretty much a linear trajectory. It was generally agreed that capitalism plus a welfare state supported by a big government was the way that modern Western democracies are best run, are best administered. And this was, to some extent, a sacred cow that was readily digested as hamburger meat by the two major political parties. This was something, to some extent, what you would call the Washington Consensus that formed after the Second World War. And both, whether you're talking about Richard Nixon, whether you're talking about Lyndon B. Johnson or Dwight David Eisenhower, or any of these major political figures all worshipped at the altar of the Washington Consensus. That the New Deal was fundamentally a good thing. The only real question was whether or is the extent to which the New Deal should affect American society. Ronald Reagan and the people that put him into power challenged that basic idea. And we are still, I would say, living in the aftermath of his revolution to some extent. We'll see what the next election cycle says, but I think that it has to be said that Ronald Reagan changed the rule, changed the paradigm. And it's kind of funny because I'll just go ahead and, go ahead and get this out of the way. And that is that, yes, Ronald Reagan was an actor. And I don't understand why this is a particular hangup because, people on all sides of the aisle say, well, Ronald Reagan wasn't a really great scholar or anything. He was, at the end of the day, an actor and not really even a good one at that. All true things. I mean, Ronald Reagan was not really an actor so much as a wonderfully chiseled face that happened to make, B movies somewhat more bearable. He would play cowboys or comedic roles, and of course, there's that famous quote from one Hollywood producer whose name escapes me. I think one of the Goldwyn, I think maybe Goldwyn or somebody. But anyway, upon learning that Ronald Reagan had been elected president, is said to have remarked rhetorically, "No, no, no. Robert Meacham for president, Ronald Reagan for funny best friend." Nobody really thought that Ronald Reagan was all that presidential, but I think what we're going to see is that Ronald Reagan, like FDR, is uniquely tailored for his time period. That everything that FDR was to television, Ronald Reagan is to radio. And let me throw this out. Something that probably is, I think that I'm going to throw out maybe a controversial point. Something that is certainly not established wisdom now, but might be later on. Something for you to chew about as you hopefully go on and continue your studies at some point in U.S. history. And that is that if you are looking for Ronald Reagan's great disciple, if you are looking for his heir, the person who follows in his footsteps, you want to know who it probably is? This guy, Bill Clinton, William Jefferson Clinton, which we'll talk about who we'll talk about rather in just a little bit. Bill Clinton is going to win an election not as a conventional New Deal candidate, because Reagan has fundamentally altered American society and the political spectrum so much that Clinton rather, is elected and makes the following concession. The era of big government is over. That Reagan pushes the political spectrum that far. Oh, there's little baby Clinton. Little baby Clinton being the heir apparent. But to understand where Ronald Reagan comes from, I think we also have to understand the context. This is still a society that is gripping with with a number of sort of crises in the 60s and 70s. You have the rise of the counterculture in opposition to the Vietnam War. And with the rise of the counterculture, you have the rise of the new left, which to some extent starts to chip away at the more or less consensus approach that the two parties have in the 40s and 50s to a great extent. And it's not just simply that you have the rise of the counterculture over the Vietnam War. The fact is that you have, for example, this chipping away at the prevailing norms of American society. For example, this is also when you start to see the flowering of the gay rights movement following the Stonewall riots in 1969. Oh, and by the way, we are still speaking of the Stonewall riots and the emergence of the gay rights movement. We are still uh, coming out of the civil rights era, and remember that the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, these are seen as major accomplishments, but the story doesn't end there, actually. The story becomes much more bitter. And with the fact that you have the rise of lots of urban riots in 1965. And of course, that's not just confined to the civil rights movement. You have, again, the Stonewall riots, and also you have the riots by Students for a Democratic Society in 1968. It seems as if the that the all the norms of American society are under strain, are under attack. And also, you have the emergence of the what's sometimes called a second wave of feminism, and more just broadly the sexual revolution. And sometimes these two things are lumped together. The sexual revolution also, by the way, encompasses to some extent the free love movement, the sort of perception that the traditional American nuclear family is not the be all end all, and that accompanying that to a certain extent, there's overlap between some of the ideas here. Is that is this sort of second wave of feminism that really revolves around two basic things: the attack on the cult of domesticity, the separation of spheres, that women should get equal pay with equal positions, and again, something that touches off in 1973 with Roe versus Wade, the fact that abortions are now legal throughout the United States, at least within the first term of the first trimester of pregnancy. And also, the fact is that in the United States, things are very unsettled. If for no other reason, just think about this: that people no longer have confidence in government. And remember, if there's one thing that the American generation of the 1930s could feel confident about, is that government had their back, at least rhetorically. That this was the era where FDR would have the fireside chats and the New Deal programs, and where when everything seemed to fail, it was government that came in and helped society out. And just think about this. Even for Americans that were in favor of intervening in the Vietnam War, you had the fact that in 1975, the North Vietnamese government, in contravention of the Paris Peace Accords, invades South Vietnam. And in a sense, it means that almost 2 decades of American military support for South Vietnam was a waste. And America had nothing to show for it except for roughly 55,000 dead, for lots of lost treasure, lots of lost wealth, and the fact that in North Vietnam, the United States dropped roughly 3 times the explosive power that it dropped in the entirety of the Pacific War. And again, it had nothing really to show for it except death, misery, and international embarrassment. And to make matters worse, almost at the same time the Vietnam War ended, you had the Watergate crisis, a Watergate affair, whatever you want to call it. Now we just call it Watergate. That any scandal, any major controversy ends with gate, because Watergate is now sort of the new standard we have for political scandals, or scandals of any kind. And the fact is that that the representative of the American government, the President of the United States, who proclaims that he is not a crook, who proclaims to speak for the silent majority of law-abiding citizens, is found out to be a crook. That there is still debate as to, by the way, whether or not Richard Nixon actually sanctions breaking into the Watergate Hotel. But what's uncontestable is that Richard Nixon does play a decisive role in the cover-up. And of course, one of the things um, with the American government during this period is it not only failed, it's not only led by, in the case of the Nixon administration, crooks, and that's not a pejorative. A lot of Richard Nixon doesn't go to jail, but a lot of the people under him do. So not only do you have those two things, the fact is that you have this increase in government spending with the Great Society, with the Johnson programs, and have very, very little to show for it. That lots of government spending on anti-poverty campaigns, on Medicare, Medicaid, and while at the same time you're spending a massive amount of money on the war. And one of the things that people criticize, especially as we'll talk about the new right, the rise of the conservatives, is that the prevailing philosophy in the post-World War II era was to just throw money at a problem and expect that it would be handled. And I think what people are becoming skeptical of is that you can't just throw money at a problem, or at the very least, if you do throw money at a problem, there are consequences, and not all of them good. Because what's going on is that, one, in 1973, you have the Yom Kippur War, where most of the Middle East, it should be said, Egypt, Syria, Iraq to some extent, Jordan, all get together and attack Israel, a nation that the United States has supported. And near the end of the war, what happens is that Richard Nixon authorizes the resupply of the Israeli forces, and the Israelis start to turn the tide. And what happens is that, to some extent, the best case scenario for a coalition to form against Israel, to, in a sense, defeat them and undo the creation of the Israeli nation in 1948, that absolutely fails. And so what happens is that the oil-producing nations, OPEC, OPEC, they gather together and they orchestrate an oil boycott of the United States. And this has the effect of driving up oil prices to a whopping $1 a gallon, up from 30 cents. But you have to remember that this is a tremendous jump. And oil is not just something you put into your car. As we'll talk about when we get to stagflation, oil is literally in everything, even things that have nothing to do with oil. More on that in just a bit. But what this is going to lead to ultimately, and this is the overall context, this is going to lead to a slow rise of what's called the new right. And really what you start to see is that the winning, the champion political racehorse of the early 20th century is this New Deal coalition, which, if you remember, encompasses white Southerners, labor unions, and minorities. Now, one of the things that you start to observe, even with the election of Richard Nixon, is that groups within basically lower class whites, so white Southerners and white union workers, they start moving from the New Deal coalition and start voting for Richard Nixon in large numbers. The election of 1968, that Nixon wins. It's still very, very close. But you start to see the breakdown of this historic New Deal coalition and the formation of another one. And if you remember, one of the things that Nixon pitches in the 1968 election is that he encourages the silent majority of Americans to vote for him. There's this idea that the majority of Americans are not out protesting the war, they're not out picketing. Most Americans are uh, more or less concerned about their economic well-being, and they want to make sure that the country's safe, that the economy's good, but they're not going to necessarily go out and protest in order to get that. And by the way, the silent majority of law-abiding Americans, what it becomes is it becomes, if you guys have heard of, um, this might not be the right term, but gestalt, where you look at a picture and you can see multiple different images depending upon what you're looking for. The silent majority is kind of a gestalt for a lot of voters, because the silent majority means to, for example, people who are for the Vietnam War, that that the silent majority of people are for the war. And so if you are part of the silent majority, you are anti-communist and for example, um, you are against, for example, the anti-war movement, counterculture. It could also mean, for example, if you are a supporter of Governor George Wallace, who is a segregationist, being a supporter of the silent majority might mean that you are in favor of continued African American segregation in the South. Now, Nixon himself is, he's a Westerner. He's an elite Republican. He is by no means a segregationist. But that does not mean that he's not going to go out and canvass their votes if necessary. And so the silent majority, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But you don't really start to see the emergence of a winning coalition until much later. And that coalition really forms during the Reagan era. Really, you're looking at the mid '70s up until the election of Reagan in the '80s. Sorry, in 1980. And really, there are three planks here. The first is that you have economic conservatives, pro-business conservatives, and by the way, it's not a coincidence that I put Ronald Reagan shaking hands with a young, svelte Donald Trump there, because during Reagan's administration, you actually do see the rise of characters like Donald Trump into the real estate market. But these are people who believe that the uh, the New Deal policies, particularly New Deal fixation on taxing individuals, taxing businesses, are not healthy for the economy, or at least are not necessarily healthy for them. And by the way, this should be nothing new. The Republican Party has always had the sort of the economic elites as a primary component of its political party. Um, this is a smaller one right here, the neoconservatives, and we'll talk about them, I think, a little bit later. Um, it's because really where they become significant is to some extent in the second Bush administration, when we talk about American intervention in the Middle East and places like Iraq and Afghanistan. The neoconservatives are at the head of that movement. And basically, the neoconservatives are in some cases in some cases they come out of the new left. These are people who are idealists that believe that America should play a force in the role for good, and that sometimes in order to play to try to be the good guys, you have to sometimes play Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry, or the good and the bad and the ugly, where sometimes you have to do the right thing, but that might sometimes involve going in and, for example, overthrowing a dictator of a regime that, like Saddam Hussein, for instance. Um, that's kind of the an incredibly short and patronizing explanation for the neoconservatives. But I think it is important to note that the neoconservatives are, by and large, they are Democrats in the 1960s and to some extent 1970s, who then become supporters of Reagan during the 80s, when he takes a very strong and ideological stance against communism, a stance that would have been antithetical and was antithetical to sort of Nixon and Kissinger's realism that the Soviet Union is here to stay and we should just deal with it. Finally, and this is really, I saved the most important for last, by the way, because this is really the most important component of the rise of the new right, and that is that you have the emergence of social and religious conservatives. And uh, and by the way, religion has not really been a partisan force in American politics historically. I mean, a lot of the early progressives, the social gospel, these were movements that very much embraced using uh, religion, especially mainstream Protestantism, as as sort of a means to embrace progressive liberal causes. In the 1980s, you start to see that slowly but surely reverse, and this is really coming in reaction to the counterculture, the emergence of the gay rights movement during the late 60s, early 70s, and also you have the sexual revolution, the sort of challenge of the cult of domesticity, the challenge of the of it's also sort of seen as a challenge against traditional motherhood, the traditional nuclear family, and the other thing is that you also have Roe versus Wade, which is even today it's a huge issue that with well, in America as a whole, if you look at the polling data, but especially for social and religious conservatives. Um, and you also have excuse me, the during the 60s, you have a ban on school prayer in the court case Engel versus Vital. So this is a group that feels that American society has taken them for granted, and they want candidates that reflect their views. And so one of the name that you should definitely remember, because it seems to come up with some frequency on the AP test, Jerry Falwell, who leads the Moral Majority, created in 1979, and it more or less peters out during the mid 80s. But the Moral Majority is important because it really is the first of many similar organizations led by individuals like Jim Baker, James Dobson of the Focus on the Family, Pat Robertson of the 700 Club, and interestingly, Phyllis Schlafly, who I think some of you who saw the Practice TBQ, you saw a document written by her to I think it was Nelson Rockefeller, and she certainly challenges this whole notion that women should embrace going out into the workforce and starting careers. But if you also remember during the Carter era, the United States receives some fairly stunning foreign policy reverses. Uh, you have the Iran hostage crisis, where over 53 Americans, including diplomats, including soldiers who work in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, are captured by uh, the followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is over here, who looks nothing like Sean Connery. Really is kind of uncanny, I've got to say. But anyway, uh, basically what happens is, if you remember, because of Operation Ajax, the leadership of Iran has been replaced with a pro-Western government led by the Shah of Iran, who's a constitutional monarch. The Shah of Iran, uh, as what tends to happen whenever you're put into power artificially by a foreign power, uh, the Shah of Iran faces a lot of domestic opposition, and so he has to increasingly use sort of authoritarian methods to clamp down on dissent. And what happens is he is eventually deposed by the leader of basically a Shiite cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and this is actually where Iran starts to become perceived as an enemy of the United States, and the feeling is certainly mutual for at least up until debatably uh, this last year. Um, but the Iran hostage crisis lasts over 450 days, and the fact that this happens during the Carter administration, and he is seen to be unable to do anything about it, is something that certainly eats away at his popularity and his credibility. But the other thing that happens is that the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979, and what happened before this is that all the presidents, from Nixon, Ford, Carter, they've been content to stay on this path of détente. In other words, the United States and the Soviet Union learned to simply accept that they disagree, that they're going to have competing interests, but that doesn't mean that you have to embrace the brinksmanship. For example, the Eisenhower and Kennedy years, where you're going to respond where you're always one step away from war. Um, but the important thing to point out, though, is that Carter is kind of like a Wilsonian. Carter is blissfully naive when it comes to foreign policy. He believes that he can deal with the Soviet Union and that all that the Soviet Union needs is to be treated fairly. And what happens is that the USSR invades Afghanistan, and the U.S. does a few things in response. They suspend the strategic arms limitation talks, also called SALT II. And this was something that Nixon had started with the SALT I talks, and Carter suspends these entirely. Carter also boycotts the Moscow Olympics of 1980. And also, by the way, the Soviet Union will be in Afghanistan really up until the fall of the Soviet Union. And one of the things the United States does is that it will actually support the Mujahideen, which, by the way, has nothing to do with this guy right here. Because, of course, the Mujahideen eventually, many of the fighters, many of the individuals that eventually become well known as international terrorists are, of course, part of the Afghan Mujahideen, the resistance fighters for against rather the Soviet Union. Now, on the positive note, you do have to give Carter this. He does actually get the most powerful of the Arabic states in the Middle East, Egypt, to recognize the existence of Israel in 1979, also called the Camp David Accords. And this is certainly a fairly stunning foreign policy success by Carter. But on the whole, what you're seeing really not just in Carter's administration, but in the aftermath of Watergate, in the aftermath of the fall of Saigon in 1975, ending the Vietnam War, you're witnessing a United States that is much more detached from what's going on across the globe. And by the way, one of the things that Carter will do that's sort of the exception to that general rule is that he issues the Carter Doctrine in 1980, where he basically establishes that the U.S. will use force to defend national interests in the Persian Gulf to sort of combat or deter the Soviet Union. And by the way, what's kind of interesting is that, of course, we're going to talk about Reagan taking a much more aggressive approach to the Soviet Union in the early 80s. But this is something that actually Carter does even toward the end. It's actually Carter that starts some of the defense spending increases, etc. But of course, economically, the economy was in really disastrous shape. And what's going on is you have a a really peculiar problem called stagflation. Um, And this is something that really from 1973 onward, the U.S. experiences really about a decade of economic difficulty. I know we think of the 70s as being the era of disco and Star Wars and maybe, some pretty fun things like that, but really economically, the 1970s were a pretty dismal time to be alive. Uh, this is where my parents actually graduated high school and came out of college. And of course, one of the things with that is that prices were uh, basically rising out the wazoo, and interest rates were skyrocketing. So here's an idea of what happens with stagflation. Uh, Stagflation is when you have an economic recession. In other words, you have a contracting economy, a shrinking economy, and you have the phenomenon of increased prices, uh, which, by the way, is not supposed to happen. Usually, what happens is that with economic, if throughout U.S. history, we've seen that you have economic growth and you have inflation to meet that growth, and sometimes that doesn't really balance out. Like, for example, the Panic of 1837, where the amount of soft money in the economy was grossly overinflated compared to what the economy actually required. But stagflation is where that's in reverse, where the actual where you actually have a shrinking economy and inflation is still increasing. In other words, prices still are increasing, and really what this goes down to is the legacy of the oil embargo in the early 70s. And if you think about it, it makes sense because if you were to go to the store and buy anything, whether that's I don't know, be weird like me. I'm gonna go out and buy the new Star Wars movie, okay? Because I'm a super nerd like that. Now, if you buy the new Star Wars movie, if you're like me, your eyes are too poor to actually see Blu-ray, so you're still gonna be old school and buy on DVD. So I got this what $15 to $20 DVD. Cool. But the thing is that $15 to $20 doesn't just reflect the awesomeness that is the Force Awakens. It doesn't just reflect the fact that it's gone through a CD factory and whatever that entails. It also reflects the fact that it took a certain amount of money to ship that good to a factory, and oftentimes it takes energy in the form of oil, or oftentimes just something a similar fossil fuel to power the factory. You actually see energy, oil used in all stages of production. And what this does is that if you don't have oil, this is going to cause prices to increase. In other words, inflation, while still leading to economic decline. So what happens is you actually have really high unemployment during this period, hovering at around 10%. And Carter makes the huge mistake of giving what is now known as the malaise speech in 1979, where he basically says, well, everything is hunky-dory. There's no real problem here except that Americans need to feel more confident. That this is really a crisis of confidence, not a problem with the economy. So, you don't know how good you have it in the United States. You can't get a job. You just need to be more confident, which to some extent, this is Herbert hoovering the problem. That there is a basis in reality there that, yeah, a lot of economic activity is based upon confidence or lack thereof. But Americans don't want to hear that it's their fault, especially it's especially a terrible thing to do in a democracy where if you tell somebody that it's their fault, that person is going to be able to vote for you in a very short period of time. That speech was 1979. The election is in 1980. And also, what's also going on is that there's a longer term process. It's actually a very historical process, deindustrialization, and this is where, and I don't think it has the key, Pooh Berries, where you see in the darker red and orange colors, these are factories. These are industrial jobs that are declining in size in the Rust Belt, the New England and Mid-Atlantic states that have focused on uh, the industrial economy, really to some extent since the mid 19th century. They're slowly but surely shutting down. They are moving, for example, towards the Sun Belt. Actually, there we are, or there I am. I live on the Cabarrus County line. So there we are, and we have added, according to the Green, 60% more industrial jobs since, I think, 1980. Woohoo! So the Sun Belt, the warmer climates of the South, um, are benefiting from this move of industry to those regions. Also, you start to see a lot of those jobs go abroad, but this causes a massive employment crisis in some of these areas. Oh, I forgot to actually title this. Whoops. Ha! You get to be part of the process. There we go. So, um, what happens in 1980 is that Ronald Reagan, a governor from California on the Republican ticket, challenges Jimmy Carter. Uh, And what happens is that Ronald Reagan wins with 489 electoral votes against a sitting incumbent. Carter takes Georgia, his home state, Minnesota, West Virginia, Maryland, Rhode Island, and Hawaii. It's not quite Herbert Hoover's, utter destruction in the election of 1932, which, if you remember, he got 4 states, but it's pretty darn close. Reagan comes in with after basically destroying and humiliating Carter. And what you should take note of is that I'm going to divide Reagan's legacy, Reagan's policy in two, because Reagan comes into the Oval Office with basically two goals. One, to reduce government, to basically turn the clock back on the New Deal, and the second, to defeat communism. The rest of the lecture will be on the first part, the reduction of government. Communism is something that needs to be tackled all on its own, because really Reagan's point, Reagan's policy of defeating communism, that really plays into the end of the Cold War. The evolution of Reaganomics. So, the thing to understand with Reagan's domestic policy and how he turns the clock back, or we can't really say turn the clock back, because that, to some extent, that implies that progress is linear, which my philosophy of history is that, if you start to use terms like progress being linear, then you're going to be guilty of being a Whig historian. Which means that you believe that history has its good guys and bad guys, and that it's a morality play. And I think that simplifies it to a certain extent. He doesn't turn the clock back, but he does change course in a very decisive way. And the intellectual underpinnings for this is you can see in the rise of the monetarist. Similarly, you can kind of see the intellectual underpinnings for the New Deal in the Keynesians. The monetarist, actually, let me go back. If you remember the Keynesians believe that the worst threat, the worst thing that can befall an economy during an economic crisis is mass unemployment. If you have mass unemployment, then what that's going to do is it's going to destroy economic growth. The monetarists, they believe that really the big economic boogeyman is inflation. And that if you have a government that tries to intervene, in other words, bails out the economy by, in the case of FDR, in a sense, bailing out the banking system or putting people to work, the monetarists believe that if you do that, you're going to generate inflation. And if you generate inflation, what you could actually do is destroy the value to your currency. And so what they believe is that, the monetarists, that quite the contrary not only is the government should the government not bail out the economy, should not only should the government not intervene, but that intervening is, in some respects, the worst thing you could do because it has the tendency of creating inflation. And the other thing is that some of the key people involved, Milton Friedman, who's kind of the intellectual leader of the monetarists, he's a Nobel Prize winning economist. Uh, they also sort of hold to this old Adam Smith idea that government is best that regulates the least because people and consumers are going to make more economically informed decisions if the government is not going to regulate them. The other key people to keep in mind is Paul Volcker, pictured here, smoking a cigar. That he was is actually, I find it really difficult to find a picture of Paul Volcker not smoking a cigar. Um, the other thing is that he's actually going to be he's actually the chairman of the Federal Reserve during the Reagan era, and you also have his disciple Alan Greenspan, who dominates the Federal Reserve during the 90s. So the first component of this, of Reaganomics, is an increase in interest rates. And one of the things to that is the idea is that if you increase interest rates, in other words, increase the cost of borrowing money, then what that will inevitably do is that will reduce prices. In other words, you start to reduce this sort of speculative bubble that tends to come about uh, whenever whenever you have an economic crisis. Now, I think it's important to realize or to think about this like let's say that you have a I hope none of you are eating. If so, go ahead and put down your fork now. Let's say that your arm is rotting. It has gangrene. You are an American Revolutionary War soldier, and you have just been shot by the British. Congratulations. Uh, and what happens if you're an American Revolutionary War soldier and you've been shot by the British in the arm is that you might need the arm amputated because it has developed gangrene and it's going to rot. Now, you can basically hold that. You can basically keep your arm and just hope for the best. But what probably will happen is that the infection, the gangrene, will spread to something more existentially essential, like the heart or thereabouts. And so the risk you take is that by not dealing with it now, it could be a lot worse down the road. So what Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve does is it basically amputates an arm. In other words, it increases interest rates, which has the effect of actually making it very hard for people to get a loan. And it also means that those who do have a loan could pay anywhere from like 15% interest. So, I mean, think about that if you owe money on a house. It's, this is actually the world my parents experienced when they graduated from college, is the fact that if you owned a house and you were paying a mortgage on it, then you were in for some misery. And so you have interest rates that were just skyrocketing out of, just insane. But this was the amputation because what happens is that eventually this results in prices rising and the situation is very stable, becomes much more stable rather. And that is one of those things that if you want to give Reagan economic credit, because by the way, this is not his idea, this is Paul Volcker's, but if you give Reagan credit, it's because of the fact that in a democracy, it is very, very easy to succumb to voter anger, particularly in the economy. And Reagan insisted on staying on the course. And what Volcker basically does is, to use another analogy we've been using over the course, he slowly but surely lets air out of the bubble, over the bubble that's been increasing because of inflation. It's not pretty, but what happens is that inflation gets back to normal in just a few years to about 3 to 5%, which is fairly normal. A little bit of inflation is okay, about, again, 2 to 5% is within reason. 15%, or which is kind of what it was, that could become very, very dangerous. Uh, the other component of Reaganomics, and probably the part that most people remember, including the people at College Board who write your AP test, are the tax cuts. And this kind of goes in with this monetarist policy, this sort of supply side economic theory, where you should support government, and the most you should support the producers in the economy, businesses, the wealthy, etc. And if you remember that actually taxes ever since World War II have been pretty high. I mean, you do have a slight reduction during the Kennedy administration, where the highest nominal rates go down to about somewhere in the 70s. But really, that is where they had, for the most part, stayed ever since the Reagan administration, until the Reagan administration. And so what happens is you have the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, and this plots a 25% tax reduction over the course of 3 years. And this kind of goes hand in hand with an overall philosophical difference of opinion that Reagan has with government, and that is that government is not the problem, is not the solution to our problem. It is the problem. Now, whenever we think about government, whenever we think about bureaucracy, we tend to think of something like this. We tend to think that there's a lot of waste that in government. That government, because is not held to the same accountability as businesses or as private sector organizations. That government is very easy for government to waste money, which to some extent can be very, very true. I mean, there is tons of government waste that we can document. But the thing is, the mind-boggling thing is that most of that waste doesn't usually total up to being all that significant, because after the Great Society, after the New Deal, the vast majority of all government expenditures isn't to this guy, the assistant to the aide of the deputy vice chairman of the committee to reduce Pentagon bureaucracy. It's to your grandma, who is collecting a Social Security distributions. And it's the thing that is preventing her from going into a nursing home. It's the fact that you have this culture that we've created during the 20th century that is now completely dependent upon entitlement spending. And with the emergence of Ronald Reagan, suddenly that New Deal, Great Society government is under scrutiny. And what Reagan tries to do is that Reagan tries to find a way to reduce the size of government, reduce government expenditures. But he ends up not being able to reduce very much, because the irony is that FDR's great political hero is FDR, and that Ronald Reagan himself actually has an emotional attachment to programs like Social Security. The programs that, by the way, tend to be the most expensive. So Reagan gets roughly $40 billion in cuts from Congress. And this, by the way, is not nearly enough what it needs to be, or what it needs to be for Reagan's program to work. Because the only way that Reaganomics works is the idea that you reduce taxes, and that results in more money being available for consumers to then invest in the economy, or rather, available to producers and the biggest of the most important of consumers, the wealthier of Americans, according to the philosophy of Reaganomics, to invest money back into the economy. But the way this works is that if you're going to reduce government tax revenue, you also have to reduce government, because that tax revenue is coming right back around and being redistributed to, for example, your grandma or the or what people on disability or Medicare, Medicaid, so on and so forth. Now, 40 billion is just not nearly enough to accomplish this. So what's going to happen, therefore, is it means that not is that even though you're sending money back into the you're cutting taxes, you're actually going to uh, create a budget deficit. In other words, you are still having to spend a lot of money on entitlements, and you're actually going to spend more than you're making in tax revenue. Now, those 40 billion in cuts, you're wondering, they're coming out of programs like school lunches, like certain student loans, um, like certain urban mass transit programs. But still, this is at the end of the day 40 billion. I know this is kind of sad to say, but 40 billion in government terms, that's pocket change. That's not nearly enough to make this plan work. The other thing, another important tenet of Reaganomics is not just the reduction of government for economic means. I mean, there is an economic argument that Reagan advances that cutting taxes is good for the economy. But again, there's also that philosophical argument that, and you start to see this in what's called the Sagebrush Rebellion. And if you remember that there's a lot of land principally held out west, that set aside by Theodore Roosevelt, etc., that is in the federal preserve program, that are national parks, so on and so forth. And we've talked about the fact that that land is either unused or it is used for it's used for national defense or other purposes. This was the big problem with the Teapot Dome scandal. What happens is that you have certain states like Nevada, for instance, which was, believe it or not, 80 to 85% of Nevada, I believe, was federal land during this period. And you have what's called the Sagebrush Rebellion, led by James Watt, who later becomes Secretary of the Interior under Reagan. There's a push to cede more federal land to state governments. And so what this also suggests, by the way, is that Reagan is, to some extent, he is a states' rights guy. He is not, pro-Confederate, I think, in any case, because I know that phrase has some political baggage with it. But there's this idea that emerges with the new right that state governments are the best overall representation of democracy. That the more local your government, the more democratic it's going to be, because the more local it is, the more responsive it's going to be to your particular needs. And so this is kind of an example of his downsizing of the federal government and his responsiveness to arguments in favor of states' rights. You also see the deregulation of industries, and to some extent, these are especially true of EPA rules. If you remember, the EPA is something that's created in the early 70s and during the Nixon and Carter administrations, and the EPA starts to talk quite openly about the fact that the United States should focus on zero growth or zero expansion, that economic and especially industrial growth is something that is potentially destructive to the environment, which, by the way, is still an open debate with the whole global warming controversy. Global warming controversy is this question of what is growth doing to the national environment and really the ecosystem of the entire globe. But you start to see deregulation of industries, whereas beforehand, car companies, for example, might have to control their emissions in manufacturing cars. This is something. These regulations are certainly relaxed, and it really happens across the board. Broadcasting standards are relaxed, and this kind of goes into this idea that advanced by the monetarists, that the government is best that intervenes the least. But also, this is something that, even despite the fact that you had the removal of roadblocks to industry, deindustrialization still continues. In fact, in 1979 to 1983, about a little under 12 million workers lose industrial jobs that either go to the Sun Belt or go to um, or are outsourced overseas. And by the way, the fact is that you start to see this growing trade deficit with Japan and Germany, but particularly with Japan, where Japan is uh, exporting more to the United States than it's importing. It's one of the reasons that the idea of tariffs against Japan during the 1980s become very politically popular. And the interesting thing is that during the early 80s, as sort of a result of deindustrialization during Reagan's early administration, is that trade deficit actually gets worse. That trade deficit, I think that there's like a $40 billion trade deficit with Japan. In other words, Japan is exporting $40 billion worth of goods more than it is importing to the United States. That goes to about 111 billion by 1983. So it's a relationship that is at least for from the U.S. perspective, getting worse. But I think it's also one of the things that's making Americans particularly ill at ease is the fact that the Japanese aren't importing low quality goods. They are exporting uh, the type of high quality, high tech goods that the United States and American workers had prided themselves on being so proficient at making. But all that being said, there is one area where, by the way, Reagan not only increases the size of government, but balloons it to an unprecedented level. And that is the area of national defense. The U.S. military, today, at least superficially, based upon, for example, fighter planes like the F-15, the F-16, battle tanks like the M1 Abrams, so on and so forth. These all come because Ronald Reagan just pours bukus of money into the defense industry, into defense expenditures. Um, and some of these things are, yeah, kind of like new tanks, new planes, fancy new toys. But how these things dovetail um, is not always intuitive. For example, like this. Yes, the internet, or at least a very primitive, sad version called the ARPANET or the DARPANET, which is basically a local um, communications network by computer that was run by the Department of the Defense, actually the Research and Development part of the Department of Defense, DARPA. And really, the internet comes as a byproduct of some of the um, influx of money that the United States pumps into the defense industry during the latter part of the Cold War. More on the internet later, but despite what you might think, it wasn't discovered or it wasn't really popularized by some guy in his garage in Silicon Valley. Really, that, like a lot of technology during this time period, comes as a byproduct of the Cold War. It's kind of a cynical and depressing thought, but one of the things with this course is that, like it or love it or hate it, when mankind sets its mind to figuring out how to blow blow each other up, we're pretty good at it. We tend to be very, very creative at it. And, the internet, well, that's not explicitly used to blow somebody up. It does certainly have a military component to it. And so speaking of really space age stuff, you also have the announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or of course what you probably remember it being known as is Star Wars. And it never ceases to amaze me. I do find that I am any single thing in Reagan's presidency, I get more questions on SDI and Star Wars. And I'm not sure if that's just because it's something you could build on Civilization, or at least some of the past iterations of the game, or if that's just because it sounds awesome, Star Wars, and it's the idea of satellites shooting lasers in space to shoot down incoming missiles. I don't know what it is, but there is something of an appeal around it. But the basic idea is that it was something that was utilized in the Cold War, or an idea that was utilized to basically make the Soviets terrified that they're ace in the hole, their mutually assured destruction capability was going to be put into question by SDI. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture when we talk about the Cold War, but it is something that becomes as an example of this growing defense spending spree. And so it does increase by about 43% over what it had been in the 70s. And what this is actually going to do is, quite apart from lowering the deficit, quite apart from cutting federal spending, actually you have a 186% increase in the deficit, more than any other president in the 20th century, except Reagan's political idol, FDR, who increases government spending, deficit spending by a paltry 1,000%. But who's counting? But this is just because of the fact that you're putting, while you're trying to cut some government, you are also increasing the size of your military while also reducing taxes. And you can start to see sort of in the 60s and 70s, you actually have the debt to GDP ratio sort of flatlining. In other words, what percentage of your of the GDP to debt is there? This is sort of what this number reflects. By the way, if it gets to about 100% or more is generally where you don't want to be. You can probably get it up to about right there, which, by the way, we're sitting right here, and it's probably more like 117% debt to GDP ratio. But you start to see it sort of trickle up in the 1980s. So the ultimate legacy, it has to be said that Reaganomics is still very, very controversial in terms of whether the policy actually succeeded. And one thing that has to be said is that economics is not an exact science, because a lot of economics is about encouraging types of human behavior. And it's sometimes difficult to assess what types of behavior are or are not encouraged. Did a tax decrease, did that actually stimulate economic activity on the part of U.S. consumers? I don't know. I am not smart enough to know. But what we can say is that by 1983, the economic malaise of the 70s had more or less been cured. You did have the GNP, the gross national product, was up by 10%, which is really good. That's sort of like what the numbers the People's Republic of China turned in during the boom years of the early 2010s. And you have a stock market surge. This is sort of the era of the big Wall Street capitalists. The idea of the quick rich schemes, etc. And also unemployment goes down quite a bit. Now, of course, part of the other legacy is that you do have a few other economic crises. You have a a savings and loan crisis. Savings and loans are a particular type of bank. And what happens in the 1980s is because you have the deregulation of these banks, regulations that were actually put into practice, I believe, during the New Deal era. What happens is that you have a savings and loan crisis where the banks actually start to collapse, particularly in states like Texas, and that you actually have a sort of the beginning of economic problems. And what's actually going to happen is right as Reagan leaves the White House during the presidency of his successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, you actually begin to see the another major recession, a recession that will eventually catapult Bill Clinton into the Oval Office. But again, the Reaganomics and the trickle down theory. This is actually where we get into contemporary policy today, and this is where what we can say is that the economy does improve in the mid '80s, at least the consumer economy. In other words, Americans become wealthier, that the gross national product increases, that unemployment goes down. Can we say whether that's caused by the tax cuts or not? Well, I think that the jury is still out, and this is where the problem of talking about contemporary events is that we're now bridging the divide between history and politics, and so this is still, to some extent, politically fresh meat. What I also can say is that one part of his legacy that I don't think is in doubt is the fact that this policy of spending does increase the federal deficit. Whether or not it could have worked with enough cuts to other areas like entitlement spending, etc. Well, it's hard to say. Um, but what we can say is that the American economy in the '80s does experience a an uptick, and if not, if for that, if just for that, I think that Reagan would probably be remembered as another Calvin Coolidge, Warren G. Harding, somebody who believed very much in the free market, believed that the Oval Office, or sorry, the U.S. government should not intervene very much, and that by and large, um, the he would might be perceived in a similar mold, if not for one very important distinction. Because unlike those presidents, the Gilded Age presidents, the Roaring '20s presidents, Ronald Reagan will play a tremendous role, will have a tremendous role in foreign policy, and that is where we get to our next lecture. So stay tuned.